Okay, so it's really lovely to be here, and it's been a great day. So thank you to Johannes for hosting. So I am doing a little bit of thinking aloud and going slightly outside my remit here. So I'm trying to bring in history and myth and deep old time to our thinking about futures. My real question here is how, if we're going to talk about story worlds, what can we learn from the ancient story worlds that we've inherited? So one of the reasons for this, I have 4 reasons for thinking about why we should do this. Not feeling defensive at all, but yeah, we have 4 reasons, I think. First one is, we talk about, the power of these popular story worlds, and quite often you'll see Lord of the Rings, or you'll see Marvel referenced as powerful spaces that we can go and inhabit. And the reality is we need to recognize Tolkien didn't invent elves, goblins, and wizards. Marvel didn't invent Thor. Both of these are, if you like, the latest version of much, much older stories that really go deep, that were not invented overnight. They're links to stories that have been around for thousands of years that help us understand what it means to be human. And I think we need to engage and really think, what does it mean to try to tell stories that have got that sort of heft, that sort of weight? Because that's what we're trying to do when we make story worlds, I think. The second reason I want to think about myth and story is because we are in a disruptive world. We are in a world of significant change. And there's a couple of people that guide my thinking here. One of them is Amitav Ghosh, writing about the importance of different sorts of stories, from the novel, from the individual psychological accounts that have dominated our literary fiction for the last couple of 100 years. And Ghosh argues that actually, if we're going to get our heads around the complexity of the world that we're living in now, we need different sorts of stories that allow us to take account of disruption, of the unexpected, where things happen that are not in control if only the hero can think their way through it. And then you might turn also to somebody like Martin Shaw, who is, I'll actually go to the next slide here. Martin's argument is that the stories we need right now turned up right on time about 5,000 years ago. And his argument is that what we need to do, what we can draw on when we look at these stories, is not the language of future scenarios, which is often about dealing with uncertainty, but a much deeper, much more challenging question of how do we learn to navigate mysteries? I think that word mystery is quite an interesting one when we think about futures work, because quite often we're trying to create light. And maybe what I'm trying to say in this talk is, what can we learn from darkness? Third reason for thinking about the mythic is that it is part of future studies already. So we can see, for example, in Sahai and Yotula's work on causal layered analysis, a lot of parallels with some of the ways in which storytellers today are thinking about different sorts of story models. So those of you who are familiar with Sahai's work will argue that any future, if you like, has to operate at the level of litany, if you like, the headline story, the sort of structures underneath it, the worldviews and the myths that drive them. And listening to Tom Hirons simply the other night, he was talking about stories having many different levels, from the deep mythical narrative and world that engages with what he calls mystery, all the way up via legends that start merging, if you like, the mythic and the historical, fairy tales and folklore, where you've got this strange melding of the unknown with a bit more of everyday life, family and cultural tales, anecdote, and at the top, gossip. And his argument is that a powerful story, if you like, allows us to move between those different levels, allows us to see the connection between the gossip as the point of connection, who we are, and then the deep roots down in the world of mystery and myth. And then the fourth reason is one that I'm a little bit nervous to say, but I see quite a lot of really banal stories coming out, really banal scenarios, often developed with the assistance of software or very familiar 4-quadrant approaches, and they generate stories that most people forget immediately, that don't resonate with people and have an impact. And I think what we see happening a lot is in future studies, we're generating stories that fail in their fundamental role. So the fundamental role of futures work is not prediction. It's shocking ourselves out of the present. It's making the present familiar. It's asking ourselves what is going on and seeing it as though it was strange. And so I'm seeing this unsettling of the present more these days in the people who are working with myth and story than I am in much of the work that is coming out as a sort of day-to-day habit in futures worlds. So these are the reasons that I think it's really important for us to think about and engage with myth. The other reason is that these things have been around for thousands of years. I mean, they're astonishing. You know, if we had a monument that had been around that long, we'd be like, God, this is incredible. These stories have been passed from mouth to mouth, from body to body for thousands of years. And one of the things that I think is really powerful of them is that they've been strengthened by the power of forgetting. So we've forgotten the stuff we don't need. So they're powerful and they're not insipid. So we should all just go and read them, okay? End of story. There we go, I'm off. What I want to do, though, is think about what can we learn from myth and old stories when we're thinking about designing our stories, our future story worlds in particular. And just to give you a sense of some of the traditions that I'm talking about here, you will all have your own myths and traditions that you're drawing on. These are ones that have been dear to me at various points, from Nordic mythology, which I have to mention because we are in Sweden, and also because we have the most amazing images of, you know, this ancient tree and these Norns who sit at the bottom spinning fates. I mean, what's going on there? And then you've got Freya, who moves between realms with her cats. I mean, she rocks. And we've also got, you know, Thor and Odin and Loki, the trickster god who's pulling the rug out beneath our feet. So if we ever needed a story to help us understand right now, maybe Loki is helpful for us. But we also draw, for me, deeply on the Welsh mythology, which has astonishing images. The woman who turns to owls. This picture you probably can't see very clearly is Rhiannon of the White Horse. And Rhiannon of the White Horse rides past the king very slowly every day. And the king and his men get on the horse and they try to catch Rhiannon. And they go faster and faster and faster. And they're on the fastest horses. And she's just going very slowly and outpaces them every time. And the only way they get her to stop is by stopping themselves and by asking her, will you stop? Can we speak to you? And that question asks us questions that maybe we need to ask ourselves right now. What do we need to stop for? What do we need to slow down for? What do we need to stop chasing? What might we need to start a conversation with? We can draw on Arthurian romance, we can draw on the Finnish Kalevala, we can draw on Russian stories, we can draw on the amazing Native American First Nation stories that bring us Coyote the Trickster. All of these are a huge cultural resource to draw on. If we're thinking about story and we're thinking about futures and we're not engaging with this, we are missing out. So what I've been trying to think about, and you know, this is emergent, is what can we learn about the making of story worlds by looking at these ancient stories? And the first thing, I think, is about asking ourselves whether we write our stories just from the position of the human. So Martin Shaw has a fabulous phrase. He talks about holding an ear to Earth's furry languages. And I'll just read you this from the Kalevala, so from very early on in the Finnish origin myth. There are yet other words too, and mysteries learned, snatched from the roadside, plucked from the heather, torn from the brushwood, tugged from the saplings, rubbed from a grass head, ripped from a footpath. The cold tale told a tale to me. The rain suggested poems. Another tale the winds brought, the sea's billows drove, the birds added words, the tree tops phrases. How are we writing our stories? Who are we writing them with? Another critical thing of these stories is that characters are really stupid. They make mistakes. They take the wrong path. Because if they don't take the wrong path, there is no story. And if they don't go wrong, if they don't go into the forest, if they don't go down into the underworld, there is no story. And if there is no descent to the underworld, if there's no accepting the witch's invitation, there is no learning. These are not stories that assume that we are rational, autonomous decision makers who are going to make the sensible decision based on the 4-quadrant scenario analysis in order to avoid the bad things. These are stories that say we are complicated, we are flawed, we are problematic human beings. We do not have the capacity for that sort of deep, enlightened foresight. So questions that we need to ask ourselves: do our stories allow this way of being human? I also love the way the gods are always arguing with each other. There's no single god that's going to fix out. There's a lot of them. They've got different forces. They've got different voices. And, they are going to be working against each other. These are stories that show us how forces create confusion. They create conflict. They create the unknown. And they tell us stories that difficulty, what is hard in life, is essential for something wondrous to emerge. So, to go to the Kalevala, early in it, we have this story of the desperate need of the man to grow a tree. And it's incredibly difficult for him to grow this oak tree. So what happens next is that a beast comes out of the sea and he sets a fire. And out of this huge fire comes a shoot. And out of this shoot comes this huge tree that blocks all the light of the world, that destroys every sense of where we are in the world. And out of the sea comes a little copper man who looks only the size of a thumb, but suddenly becomes the size of the world and is able to cut down this tree. And as he cuts down the tree, it falls, it splinters. The shards of the tree land in the water and travel northward, where they are gathered by a witch to make an arrow tip. The hard, the uncomfortable, the difficult creates a generative moment of possibility. These are also normative stories. They are not stories that are about assessing advantage. They are not stories about how do we do well in this environment. These are stories about balance. These are stories about how energy and wisdom, youth and age, the city and the forest, Arwen, inspiration, and logos, rationality, can be in balance with each other. And they are stories of guidance. They're stories to help us think about what might survive. This is the amazing goddess Inanna from some of the very, very earliest human stories, who has the wings of inspiration, the amazing lion of courage, and these great owls of wisdom. I mean, she rocks. This is just astonishing. Think about what it would mean to be that sort of powerful being. So critically, these stories tell us that story worlds don't have to come from the human, that they can have characters that can make mistakes, that we need to work with gods that don't agree with each other, that we can draw on difficulty, that we might work ourselves towards balance, and we might pay attention to processes of going through darkness and coming out again. They also tell us something about what it takes to create and make stories. Almost all of these stories have something about what it means to be the poet or the storyteller. And again, we see this story of the poet drawing on the world and many experiences that are not all human. I really advise you to go read this amazing poem, The Battle of the Trees. But just listen to this. I was a path, I was an eagle, I was a coracle at sea, I was bubbles in beer, I was a raindrop in a shower, I was a sword in the hand, I was a shield in battle, I was a harp string enchanted 9 years in water, foaming. I was tinder in fire, I was a forest ablaze. What does it mean to write from that position? Poets come from somewhere. They've got origin tales of their own. The people who are making stories come from a place. Taliesin comes from the cauldron of the powerful witch Ceridwen. Wainamoinen comes from the air woman, growing for centuries in her womb. Becoming a poet is not easy. There's a huge amount of shape-shifting required, labor pains, courage. This is not about doing a quick course. And they're quite honest about the fact that the bodies and needs of the storytellers need feeding. They say, if this is from the Kalevala again, I will sing quite a good tale, quite a fair one I'll beat out, after some rye bread and some barley beer. If beer is not brought and ale not offered, I'll sing from a leaner mouth. We need food, we need beer, we need feeding in order to do this sort of work. And then the question comes, who is feeding us? And what stories can we tell if we're not fed? What does this mean? These are my conjectures. What does this mean for making Storyworlds in future studies? I think it gives me a set of questions. I'd be fascinated to know what it gives you, but this is what it gives me. It gives me questions about where our roots, our anchors, our lands are as we're making our stories. How are the trees and the birds, the insects, the waves, the winds, the heat teaching us words? How are they telling us tales? What are the limits of sitting in rooms with post-it notes? What sort of stories come out of that don't come out of this? It raises questions for me about where are we born from? What worlds are going into making us? And can we make worlds that are capable of dealing with the sorts of complexity that we see in these other narratives? They make me wonder where the underworld is in our stories. Where's the darkness? And where are we becoming initiated? Where are we learning from it? Really, what I want to suggest is that a critical feature of myth is it invites us in a journey to the underworld. It invites us to break the spell of the present, not so that we can plan the future, but so that we can shake ourselves awake. So in the last presentation, there was a discussion about a threshold, the moving of a threshold. Moving across a threshold also usually involves a breaking, a loss of something, a loss of personhood, a remaking of the self. You don't come back to the world the same person. So myths, I suggest, invite us to create stories that allow us to break ourselves a little bit. These are not stories of comfort. These are stories that say, actually, maybe from this position, this continuing in this body, continuing in this shape, is not where we want to be starting if we want to make powerful stories that allow us to see the world differently, allow us to see the world in a different way. If you want a flavour of any of these, I'd suggest looking up any of these stories: the Moon Palace, the woman who became a fox, and the Firebird. And critically, I think what's implicit in what I'm saying here, but I think it's really important to say it, is that mythic storytelling here is not about corporate futures work. It's not about how we maintain advantage. It's about creating an experience that grabs us by the scruff of the neck and asks us if we want to go into the darkness, let go of everything that we know, and think about what else might be possible. And critically, this is about creating people. So the process of participating in myth, the process of participating in any rites of passage, which many of these are, is about the work on the person. It is not about the creation of a world. It's about the creation of people that are able to handle the complexity of the worlds that we're living in. Thank you.
Please take. Thanks a lot, Kerry. That was fascinating. During your talk, there were some questions posted in the chat, so I actually thought I should fire them off to you while I have you up here.
Okay.
There was one question from Jessica. What about critiques that myths reinscribe outmoded stereotypes and roles?
I think what happens is that if we read a myth through our worldview, we will see a woman as a woman. We'll see a man as a man. Whereas actually, a different way of reading it, so if we take what we call a mythopoetic approach, is to say that all characters in a story are aspects of ourselves. So you can think of the sovereign, you can think of the young man, you can think of the child, you can think of the firebird, you can think of the young woman. All of them are different aspects of ourselves. And one of the things that happens when you listen to and connect with these stories on a regular basis is different moments in a story will resonate with you at different times. So rather than being incredibly literal, which is what we tend to do when we read these things, and we say, oh goodness, this woman is, look at her, she's not fully emancipated, is actually, we say each story holds a myriad aspects of who we are, and we can see how they play off against each other as we read or as we engage or as we listen to these stories. So I think that would be the way in which I see that.
Thanks a lot. And Amos has a question reflection saying that, so there is a kind of nostalgia to myths, of course, but could this nostalgia then also guide us?
Yeah, I don't see it as nostalgic, because nostalgia usually suggests you're going back somewhere comfortable. Okay, so you got this idea that you go home and it's all nice. That's at the heart of the concept of nostalgia, that you go back somewhere safe. Actually, what these myths give us are resources for living in difficult times. That's my sense. This is not a comfy return home to, don't worry, here's a nice story of Sleeping Beauty. That's what Disney gives you. That's what Marvel gives you. Don't worry, here's a simple hero. What we've actually got here is complicated people, difficult stories that require you to think about what it means to live in very hard times. So I think they're actually the opposite of nostalgic.
Thanks a lot. We are moving on. Please be seated, Carrie. So for those of you who've just zoomed in now, you have entered the session